Hey, welcome to COMP9444, Neural Networks and Deep Learning. My name's Alan Blair. I'm the lecturer in charge for this course. Some of the lectures will also be given by Hao Xue, probably in weeks 4 to 7. And we have two course admins for this course, Zara Don Yavi and Fatima Morgani. They were course admins last term for the same course, and they're very competent, which is good. And all correspondence for this course, if you need to contact us, you should always use this central admin address, cs9444 at cse.unsw.edu.au. Now, before we get to the administrative stuff, let's just remind ourselves why we're studying deep learning or what's so interesting about deep learning. So there's been some impressive breakthroughs in recent years using deep learning. So in the area of game playing with AlphaGo and AlphaGo Zero and AlphaStar, and also in medicine. So in particular this AlphaFold breakthrough at DeepMind in London, which led to the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2024. And here are just a few other areas where there's been big breakthroughs recently. So object detection, with YOLO and other similar systems where they look at images and extract objects from them. And also the area of so there's image processing, there's language processing. You're all familiar with the text generation and code generation with ChatGPT and so on. Then there are applications that mix images and text. We call that multimodal artificial intelligence. So, for example, image captioning, you take an image and automatically generate a caption for it. It's supposed to be a description of what's going on in that image. Sometimes it gets it slightly wrong. Here it says two young girls playing with Lego toy. I'm not sure if that's a young girl or an adult, but it's pretty impressive that it can look at an image and come up with this kind of caption. And of course now we can go the other way. We have image generation. You enter a caption and the system will generate the image. Now there are other kinds of multimodal AI. So more recently these two things have sort of been combined into dense image captioning. It's a bit hard for you to see what's going on in this slide, but it's identifying images. These are very dense images. It's identifying objects inside the image, and it's also providing micro captions, if you like. So it's telling us that the elephant is standing. The ball is white, the rocks are on the ground, I don't know. So it's sort of giving some description about the relationship between the various objects. So it becomes much more a richer description of what's going on in these images. And there's also visual question answering. So you present an image, typically you present an image and a question. So you give an image and then you ask, who's wearing glasses in this image. So here it's the man, and there it's the woman. Presumably, where is the child sitting? Is the umbrella upside down? So sometimes it's different types of. I've had a student recently graduated who was working in this area. Sometimes it's yes or no questions. Sometimes it's kind of the answer is a number. Sometimes the answer is more free-form text. And this can get also into the area of robotics, where we have, in this is a system where someone's interacting with a robot arm and giving it instructions. So it says, pick up the toy with the black and yellow face. So it picks up the penguin. Pick up the blue soda can in the middle. So that's, you can specify spatial relationships. There's 3 soda cans here. I want the one in the middle. And the robot can ask clarifying questions if need be. I tell it to pick up the ball, and then it's trying to figure out which ball it should pick up. So it's asking, do you mean this green tennis ball on the table? And so you can say yes, or no, I mean the stripy yellow one over there. So these are just, like, again, this is just a kind of snapshot of some of the recent developments. And we hope to look in more detail at a lot of these things as the course progresses. But as you can see, in addition to the things that we've mentioned already, there's voice, as well as image generation, there's voice generation, song generation, and increasingly video generation. So there are tools that you can use to make your own videos. You can design characters and then animate those characters. And this is all kind of moving along at a very fast pace. And the latest thing is like agent-based AI. So LLMs, which can actually kind of make their own decisions or do some logical reasoning, and this is what's getting some people a little bit scared, that they might make decisions which are adverse to the human race if we're not careful. So AI and deep learning in general is this huge area. It's kind of revolutionizing all areas of our lives. Now, there's these 3 terms which are sometimes sort of used interchangeably. It's a bit hard to distinguish them sometimes, but roughly speaking, we can say that, so just lower the volume a little bit. Roughly speaking, artificial intelligence is the development of smart systems and machines to carry out tasks which traditionally required human intelligence. Machine learning is creating algorithms that learn from data to make decisions or assist with decisions perhaps based on the patterns that are observed. So with machine learning, typically, not always, but typically a human intervention is required to kind of interpret the results or decide what to do based on those results. And deep learning, which the focus of this course is using complex and deep artificial networks to reach accurate conclusions without human intervention. So it's deep in the sense it sort of extracts features from the data, but are like a hierarchy, low-level features and high-level features. And typically, you need a lot of data to train these models, and usually annotated data, although there is also, we will talk about unsupervised learning where you use unannotated data. There's a big push to kind of, because it's sometimes expensive and difficult to provide the annotation, there are efforts to try to learn with unannotated data, or a mix of a small amount of annotated data and a larger amount of unannotated data. Okay, now just to get to the details of how the course is going to run. So the lectures are in this room. I think that's the right number. This is the Science Theatre. It'll be in weeks 1 to 5 and 7 to 10, so we won't have a lecture in week 6. That's the flexibility week. The lectures will be Tuesday 2 to 4, which is now, and Wednesday 11 to 1. Now, the way this course will run, there'll be tutorials will run in weeks 1 to 5, and then group mentoring sessions will be running in weeks 7 to 10. Now, we're going to use pretty much the same locations and time slots for the mentoring sessions as the tutorials, and usually the same tutor will become the mentor. Now, depending on the group formation, a small number of you may change to a different time and location, potentially after week 5. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that further down the track. But this is what's happening now. I do apologise. We got this issue. We have quite a few Monday tutorials scheduled for this course. There's kind of a shortage of space in the university, and we kind of had to accept some Monday time slots. So, and there's the additional complication that next Monday is a public holiday. So, considering that, we made the decision that we would run the tutorials on Monday in week 1. So some of you, how many of you went to a tutorial yesterday? I'm curious. Yeah, so I do apologize for that. You had to go to your tutorial before the lecture, but we gave you some little videos to watch in preparation. So I hope that worked out okay. And there will be some arrangements made for the Monday people. There will be some arrangements made for next week. Some of you may have sessions still running on Monday but online, or in some cases it may be rescheduled to Tuesday or another day. So we'll put information on the course website about that for the details. Now, we're going to be using two platforms. Yeah, there's sort of proliferation of different platforms in various courses. We're trying to deliver everything through two platforms that hopefully most of you are already familiar with. One of them is WebCMS, and the other is Moodle. Now let me just see if I can show you the course website here. I don't know. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so this is the course website in WebCMS. Most of you should have access to this. If there's some late enrollments, when you enroll in the course, it does take a day for you to be added into WebCMS. That happens at midnight, so there's a bit of time delay for that to filter through. So please be patient about that. So here's the course outline, and then so the lectures and the tutorials will be here. So this is today's lecture, slides are in there, and the tutorial questions, and then the Moodle page might look a bit different from this. There's some resources that are hidden that we didn't need, but basically we're going to be using, so the lecture recordings, of course, will be accessed through Moodle. My experience when it starts running will be through here, and the group formation, we're still sorting out the details, but we believe the group formation will be happening through Moodle, and we're going to be using Moodle for these course forums as well. So if you've got, we've set up forums, the general forum, and then specific forums for each week, the content of each week. Yeah. So if you have questions, please post them to these Moodle forums, and we'll try to. We've got people assigned each day to check the forums, and we'll try to respond in a timely manner. Okay, so the tutorials, as I mentioned, the tutorials in weeks 1 to 5, you'll be discussing worked examples and developing deeper understanding of fundamental topics, and then it'll kind of switch over to mentoring sessions to assist with the group project. So you must keep up with the lectures, either come here and attend in person, it's good to see so many of you here in person, or you can watch the recordings afterwards. These lectures are not going to be live, they won't be live streamed, but the recording will be available within a couple of hours through Moodle. Now some of you have enrolled in the web stream. This is just because of the fire regulations. We can only enroll a certain number of people into the in-person stream, and the others have to go into the web stream. But if you are in the web stream, you're very welcome to come and sit in the lecture if you wish. There's almost always some seats available, right? So by enrolling in the web stream, you're just acknowledging that in the unlikely case that every seat is taken, then you would have to miss out, but that's not likely. So yes, so please review the course materials before and after the lecture. Try to attempt the tutorial questions beforehand and be ready to ask questions. Complete the tutorial exercises and the assignment in the group project. Discuss the material with your fellow students, and if you get interested in a particular topic, you should think about exploring it further for your own interest. And please also, as I said, if you want to ask some questions or contribute to the discussion, do it in the Moodle forums. Now, the textbook, we don't. I mean, it's we've got 3 textbooks here that we've looked at that we think are good. The one we're trying to follow most closely is this one here, Understanding Deep Learning. These other 2 books are also good. I think that all of these books, the material is available online. If you go and have a look at these, go to these URLs, you should be able to view each chapter online if you don't want to have the physical book. Now, there'll be some assumed knowledge for this course, particularly to do with mathematics. So we assume that you have a working knowledge of linear algebra, probability, multivariable calculus, and the chain rule. So roughly speaking, we're assuming the content of Math 1B, I suppose. So most of you, and we will be discussing a little bit about probability in the lectures, just specifically the kind of probability that we need for the course. But those of you, if you're a little bit rusty on these topics, you may want to just kind of brush up a bit in the first few weeks. Now, this is the planned topics. So we have these, we say week 0, but these are just kind of refreshers that we want you to work through. Python, NumPy, Matplotlib, and Google Colab. So this course will assume a working knowledge of Python. So if those of you who are postgrads should have done the Python course already. The undergrads, you should have some knowledge of Python from earlier courses, but you may need to brush up a bit. So just go and have a look at these refreshers. They're linked from the week 1 tutorial questions. And so it goes. So this week we're going to look at neuroanatomy and perceptrons and multi-layer perceptrons. The next week we'll look at probability and generalization and overfitting and PyTorch, and the topics kind of go on like this. Well, the third week we'll look at some variations of backprop, cross entropy, softmax, weight decay, momentum, and also look at hidden unit dynamics, like how to kind of visualize and analyze what's going on inside neural networks. Then the rest of the course is going to be broken down by application areas effectively. So we're going to look at image processing, and then language processing, and then reinforcement learning, and then after that unsupervised learning and multimodal learning. So that's kind of the way it's structured, and at the last couple of weeks we may have some guest lectures on some specific topics. Now, the assessment for this course, there's going to be a written, degree assignment that has to be done on an individual basis, which will be due at the end of week 5. That's worth 20%. And then there'll be a group project which is done in groups of 5 people, and that'll be a total of 30%. It'll be broken down into a notebook and a report and a presentation. And the final exam will be 45%. And then there's going to be 5 marks for class participation. So that'll be these weeks 1 to 5 tutorials. There'll be some tutorial questions, and there'll be some exercises, and you'll get a mark for participating in those exercises. So that's like 1 mark per week. And the group project, the final presentation will be in week 10. There won't be any hurdle for this course. When we add up all the components, you have to get a mark of at least 50. And excuse me, we expect you to form yourselves into groups by the end of week 4. Now, the assignment we'll be releasing probably the beginning of week 3. It may involve, this is just sort of roughly what it may involve. So you may be provided with some PyTorch code, and you have to run it and analyze the results. You might have to write your own PyTorch code. You may have to run some experiments and analyze the networks. It's that kind of thing is what you should expect. Now, here's a more detailed breakdown of what you're expected to do in weeks 1 to 5 for those individual marks, and what you're expected to do in weeks 7 to 10 for the group project. So, for week 1, you're supposed to, as well as answering the tutorial questions, you're supposed to walk through these exercises about, well, go through the refreshers, and there's some exercises, there's some Python exercises and some tensor exercises. So, and then for week 2, there's some PyTorch exercises, and then there'll be a paper reading exercise. Again, I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And similar for week 3. Now then, you should be starting to organize yourself into groups. So, group formation, choosing a project, finding the data sets, planning it, and so on. And then again, this sort of breaks down roughly what you're expected to do in each week leading up to the project submission. And now, for this, we considered, I think, we considered having participation marks for weeks 7, 8, and 9 as well. I think that has been done in some previous terms, but for administrative reasons, we've just kept the marks of weeks 1 to 5. But we will be taking note of attendance in these other weeks, and everyone in the group must contribute, their fair share to the efforts of the group. So we understand, so for these weeks 7 to 10, the mentoring sessions, you have to arrange with the mentor how this is going to run. It may be that not all groups have to be there for the whole 2 hours. There may be a schedule that the mentor will speak to one group in a certain time period and so on. It might be broken down like that. And we do understand that sometimes some members might not be able to attend on a particular day, or might be able to only attend remotely. But in any case, everyone has to contribute to the project and pull their weight. And as I said, we will be noting attendance, and if there's any dispute at the end of the term about whether someone made an adequate contribution, then we may look at the attendance record as part of that process. Okay, so again, we're trying to provide as much information about this as possible so you know what's expected. So you should be working to try to get yourselves into a group of 5. Ideally, all members of it can be a mix of postgrads and undergraduates in the same group, doesn't have to be segregated. Ideally, you should try to form a team from within your tutorial, if you can. We do understand that may not always be possible. So we may have situations where you form a group and 3 people are in the Wednesday 6 p.m. and the other 2 are Monday 9 a.m. or whatever. In that case, you have to be, some group members will have to be willing to move to another day or time. So from past experience, we've found that this, the number of students involved is relatively small, but that option is available. Now we're going to be posting a list of potential projects, and normally you should choose a project from that list. If there may be rare cases where there may be some other project that you really want to do that's not on the list, we may consider that, but we have to really look at it and make sure that it's a suitable project for this course. You'll be assigned a mentor, and the groups will meet with a mentor during those 2-hour sessions. And at the end, you'll give a presentation in week 10, and you'll submit usually a Jupyter notebook. You'll give a presentation slides and a report. So we'll be putting this up within the next few days, a list of projects. I know you can't read this, but this is an example. So there's sort of a problem description. There's an area of research, in this case computer vision. There's a description of the problem. There's a description of a data set or data sets and the task, and then a list of relevant papers, so that we've tried to make them all have this consistent format. So you'll be able to go through the list and sort of figure out what you prefer. Now, we'll be using PyTorch for implementing the neural networks in this course. Now, some of you, some of you may have used Theano or TensorFlow before. If you have, you should be able to adapt to PyTorch fairly easily. These neural network packages are kind of similar in structure. We prefer PyTorch for teaching purposes because the way it's structured is very clean and it's kind of easier to see and understand what's going on under the hood kind of things. That's why we prefer PyTorch. Now, having said that, for some, it may happen for the PyTorch is preferred for the projects as well, but depending on the project, it may happen that there's some code that you need to use that's written in TensorFlow or something. So in that case, you may get permission to use TensorFlow instead of PyTorch or whatever. We can discuss that when we get to the projects. But for the assignment, we'll be using PyTorch, and for the code examples throughout the course, we'll generally be using PyTorch. Now, it's up to you to decide which version of Python you want. So, I mean, I have a Mac. I use the PyTorch. I myself use the Python in Mac ports. So, if you have a preference for a particular Python package implementation, that's okay. But if you don't have a strong preference, we do recommend Anaconda because it's kind of the easiest to install. It gives you the most flexibility and control, and it automatically installs dependencies and so on. So that's kind of the default option. So in the first couple of weeks, you should be setting up Python and PyTorch on your laptop. So if you go to the PyTorch website, there's very good instructions there about how to install on different platforms, and also Anaconda. These are the versions of these modules that we use on the CSE machines. So we ask that you install it. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but like the same or later versions on your own machine. And we'll also be making use of Jupyter notebooks. We expect your project to be submitted in the form of a Jupyter notebook. So if you're not familiar with that, you should maybe look at this website and familiarize yourself with how Jupyter notebooks work. Now, hardware acceleration. So a lot of laptops don't support CUDA. Like my laptop, for example, has an AMD chip. It doesn't really support CUDA, so I can't run as a GPU. I can't run this on a GPU myself. A lot of people are in that situation where they don't have a suitable GPU on their laptop. So you may need, for the project, you may need to have access to bigger GPUs. And we recommend, the option that we recommend for that is Google Colab. And so we have some links from the tutorial as well, how to set up Google Colab. And you get a certain number of resources for free through that means. Okay. Just a few more slides. Well, does anyone have any questions at this point? Okay, so let's focus specifically on week 1 and week 2. So to get the tutorials, you just go to the web CMS and look at the tutorials. We try to make the tutorials for next week. We're still editing a little bit. We try to make them available tomorrow. Now, so for this week's checkpoint, part of the time has been allocated to working through these Python exercises and tensor basics. So the last sort of 40 or 45 minutes of your tutorial should be spent having a look at these refreshers and working through the exercises. Most of these refreshers, it's just kind of snippets of code one after the other. So it's just kind of reading through it and maybe copying and pasting the code into a Python program and running it to see what happens. But there are a couple that actually have specific exercises. I think the Python and the tensors. So work through that and show your work to your tutor. Now for week 2, as I said, we'll be posting this tomorrow, but this is just a heads up what to expect. So there'll be some tutorial questions, and then there'll be a link to a paper. So you're expected to kind of read that research paper and then have a discussion about it, and it will be a sort of guided discussion. People will be divided into groups of 5, and people will be taking different roles within the discussion. So one person is taking the role of looking at it from the point of view of the archaeologist, and another one from the industry practitioner and the social impact assessor and so on. So this just kind of livens up the discussion a bit and makes it from different viewpoints. Plagiarism is taken seriously in CSE, as you probably know already. All work submitted for assessment must be your own work. So for the individual assignment, it's fine to discuss with your fellow students basic ideas, but you should write the code and the report yourself, and do it without using and really do it yourself, not using ChatGPT or other crutches. Plagiarism detection software may be used to detect plagiarism. But anyway, for your own good, you should be learning to do things yourself and not rely on others. Now, there are a lot of AI-related courses offered by the school. Some of you may have done some of these already. So there's an AI course, there's more general artificial intelligence. There's a machine learning and data mining course. There's an advanced machine learning course. There's knowledge representation and reasoning. This apply to artificial intelligence, I think, might not be offered this year. I'm not sure, but it might come back again next year. There's also machine vision, robot software architecture, and these are 2 relatively new courses that were just introduced the last year or 2, recommender systems and natural language processing. So there's quite a variety of courses here. And also, those of you who are undergraduates, you may get interested in doing a thesis topic in an AI-related area. So I'll be maybe posting some possible topics, and there's quite a few artificial intelligence researchers in the school who may have different topics on offer. Now, so I just wanted to mention that. So the last question in the week 1 tutorial is a sort of discussion about what potential dangers deep learning may pose to society. And so these are the advances that we mentioned, right? All these fantastic stuff that's happening, but some people are starting to get worried there's also kind of threats and challenges involved. Now, this is a huge topic. I could speak for an hour just on this topic, and in fact, I've been asked to go and speak on Thursday about this to the Australian skeptics. But for the moment, I want to sort of mainly leave this to you guys to have a discussion in your tutorial groups, but let me just mention a few points here. So these are some of, not all, but some of the threats and challenges. So first of all, there's a possibility that a lot of jobs could be displaced by artificial intelligence. And it's not only about the number of jobs, but the type of jobs. You know, so some, with all of this automatic content generation happening, there may be situations where, you know, previously someone's job would have involved writing reports or summaries or briefs or different things. But in the future, it may be more a question of just, you know, taking something that's been written by AI and then checking the details and making sure it complies with certain regulations. So there's sort of like a shift in psychology to a different type of role. There's also concern about energy consumption. You know, these data centers are taking up huge amounts of energy. And there is a view, I personally share the view that actually a lot of these models, although they're fantastic, you know, these LLMs and so on, although their accuracy and performance is fantastic, probably they're a lot more wasteful of energy than they should be, you know. So I think there should be more, in my opinion, there should be more effort put into research on trying to find models which have similar accuracy but with less energy consumption. And finally, some people think that AI may pose an existential threat to humanity. You know, that once, especially with these agents that are making their own decisions and so on, they may ultimately make decisions that are detrimental to the humans. So these are some. There's also issues about education and privacy and etc. They haven't even listed here, but this is some of the issues. Now, let me just say something specific about this issue of technological unemployment. We can sort of figuratively imagine the situation by looking at these images, which I did generate using AI. So if you'll bear with me, the river here represents jobs that have already been automated, right? And the land represents jobs that are still being done by humans. And the river is constantly rising over time. Now, up until now, we've faced a situation which is analogous to the picture on the left, in the sense that, yes, the river is rising, but the land is sufficiently steep that as the water rises, it's easy for the humans, there's plenty of space for the humans to just walk up the hill and occupy the high ground where they'll be safe. So this has been the situation up until now, and some people believe that it's still the case, but there's a growing number of commentators who fear that the current situation might be more akin to the picture on the right, where the land is relatively flat, so that as the water rises, it may actually inundate the land very quickly, and the humans may have to run fast to reach dry land, and there may not be enough space for all of them. So this issue of technological, and of course new jobs are always going to be created by technology, but the question is, will they be created fast enough to replace the jobs that go, right? So your view on this largely comes down to whether you believe this picture or that one. Yeah. Any questions about this? What do I believe? Well, I personally tend to think that more jobs will be destroyed than created. It may not happen quickly. It may be a rather slow process, but I think the number of jobs will decrease over time. And unfortunately, it's going to be the younger people who are more adversely affected because they're looking for the entry-level positions. Sorry to say. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the same.
You think the same. But if we educate ourselves about these tools, then hopefully we can stake out some of this higher ground for ourselves. Good, okay, we'll come up to 2:55. I think we'll take a 5-minute break now, and then when we come back, I'll start talking a bit about the neuroanatomy.
That I and my teammate master be in the same tutorial, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and after week 5, we have auto rearrange to under the same tutor.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
We're still looking into the details, but basically there'll be a mechanism where you can, normally it would be the majority. Normally the minority would join the majority, but there may also be a mechanism for you to specify which one you would prefer.
I got a specific issue that I want to major in LLM in the future.
Yeah.
So to have any recommendation about the related courses until even master. The related courses about LLM, just not only
The LLMs.
This is just about AI, but it's a wide range.
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably the natural language processing would focus most on the LLMs.
Yeah, I know it's about the language, like the characters, like the words, and
I was just talking to there is a proposal to try to have a course on what's it called? Your time series.
time series.
But I don't. It
that.
probably won't happen.
Kinds of
I don't know if it'll happen next year, though. It might be the year after.
Yeah, I know that.
I mean, several of these. Well, we'll talk somewhat about LLMs in this course, but I think the NLP course might go into more details.
But I'm afraid of that. NLP is the old courses. You know that during the past several years, a lot of people are majoring in NLP. So, and
Good. Oh, sorry, it's just been brought to my attention that some of these items on Moodle, the submission deadline is wrong. Yeah, so we're kind of a bit new to Moodle, and it's the first time we've had this submission through Moodle, so somehow there's something wrong with the deadline. So the group formation is due in week 4, and the project submission is in week 10. So I'll update those deadlines this afternoon. So I apologize for that confusion. So now we're going to sort of have a look at some background here, a bit the history of neural networks and the motivation. So what is a neural network? Is a massively parallel distributed processor, and it acquires knowledge from an environment through a learning process, and the knowledge typically is stored in the form of synaptic weights. So there are these parameters or weights in the network that have certain values. Now, I suppose today, if you ask why do we study neural networks, it's just because they have very good performance. But historically, the reason people started studying these things is these sort of reasons. You know, they're biologically inspired. They have pretty good learning properties. They can capture continuous, nonlinear relationships. They're well adapted to certain tasks like image processing, for example. And they just exhibit what's called graceful degradation. So some types of computer systems will handle input up to a certain size, and then when you exceed that size, they sort of catastrophically fail. Neural networks, as you increase the size of the task, generally speaking, they still do a pretty good job, but maybe the performance starts to degrade a bit. So this is, graceful degradation. Now, the human brain exhibits what's known as subsymbolic processing, which means that we kind of recognize an object often as an amalgamation of smaller features. So we can get an idea of this by looking at these sort of random dot pictures. Some of you may have seen some of these pictures before, but can anyone see an animal? Can anyone recognize an animal in this image? A Dalmatian, yeah, who said Dalmatian? Yeah, that's right. It's like a spotted dog. So put your hand up if you can see a dog. A few of you. Okay, let me point out some components. So this is the head of the dog here. That's its ear. That's its mouth. It's kind of sniffing along the ground. It's facing away from us. And this here is its front legs, and that's its back legs there. And that's the hump in its back. Okay, now, having pointed these things out, put your hand up if you can now see the dog. A few more. Okay. Now, but what's interesting about this image, when this image is shown to people from certain cultures, particularly African cultures, the people often say that they recognize a hyena rather than a dog. And then when they're asked more details, like can you point out features of the hyena, this is what they say, that actually the front legs of the dog become the back legs of the hyena. The back legs of the dog become the front legs of the hyena, and this here is the face of the hyena. That's its ears, that's its eyes, and this is its mouth. Okay, so instead of a dog looking away, we have a hyena facing towards us. So looking again at this image, who can now see the hyena. Some of you. Okay. I mean, it just, this illustrates the fact that perception is theory-laden. What we see in an image, to some extent, is influenced by our experience, what kind of objects we've seen in the past, and what we expect to see. I wanted to show in another example. This is supposed to be a cowboy riding on a horse. I think that's the horse's face, that's its front legs, that's its back legs, that's its tail, that's the body of the cowboy, and this is his cowboy hat. So, who can see a cowboy? Yeah, okay. So, this just illustrates the way the human brain works, that if you try, it's just like a lot of these small features being amalgamated together to make a big object. Now this, I won't go into too much detail about this, but theories of intelligence date back to the classical era. There was this long-running debate between rationalism and empiricism. Roughly speaking, rationalism means that, like, you're born, like innateness, like that you're born with certain preconceived ideas. Empiricism, in its purest form, you're born as a kind of blank slate, you know, a tabula rasa, and then you learn things from experience. And this debate raged for centuries, and then eventually Immanuel Kant wrote his Critique of Pure Reason, in which he tried to resolve this by saying that, you know, the reality is some sort of compromise between rationalism and empiricism. But this comparison is still interesting if you look at animal, like this trade-off, you know, like a baby deer can walk very soon after it's born, whereas a human infant can't walk for like a year. It takes about 12 months before a human infant can walk, right? So we take a lot longer to learn to do these things than animals, but the human is more flexible. The human can learn to do a lot more things than the deer, because the deer is kind of constrained by its instinct. So there is this interesting trade-off. The more that's inbuilt, the less flexibility that you have to learn new things. Then philosophically, you got Descartes with his mind, you know, the question whether is the mind something separate from the brain, or is it the same as the brain, is the issue of dualism. And then you have the early psychologists like Sigmund Freud and Skinner in the 20th century. Now, if we look at artificial intelligence, this kind of dates back to in the 1600s, both Blaise Pascal and Gottfried Leibniz both had a sort of similar idea that the mind works like a mechanical calculator. I don't know, this is just a few things from the history. You know, the Mechanical Turk, we're familiar with the phrase Mechanical Turk, but, you know, the original Mechanical Turk was a kind of chess-playing automaton that was invented by Wolfgang von Kempelen at the court of Maria Theresa in Austria, and it inspired, seeing the Mechanical Turk inspired Charles Babbage to build his different, and, you know, he saw it on display when he was 8 years old, and when he grew up he teamed up with Ada Lovelace to try to design this difference engine. Yeah, it was sort of an early computer that was fully mechanical. Unfortunately, he never had enough money to build it, but if he had the money, it probably would have been the first computer. And then you get into sort of logical reasoning with Boole and Frege. The first, Alan Turing came up with the Turing test in 1950, like discussing how to test whether a system is intelligent or not. And the very first artificial intelligence conference was held at Dartmouth in 1956. So that's kind of AI in general. Now, if we look at neural networks, McCulloch and Pitts in the 1940s were doing studies of individual neurons in the brain. Norbert Wiener invented the field of cybernetics, which is kind of like robotics. Alan Turing, as well as inventing the Turing test and the Turing machine and various other things, code breaking, he also, late in his life, he wrote a paper where he described kind of simple neural networks. Oliver Selfridge in the 50s was studying pattern recognition and particularly early image processing. Hubel and Wiesel were doing studies in the 60s looking at the human visual cortex and how it processes information. And then Frank Rosenblatt invented the perceptron in 1962. Okay, so that's like the neural network origins. There's also a sort of parallel stream of artificial intelligence which is more focused on like symbolic methods. Yeah, but we won't go too much into that. Now, this sort of a potted history, neural networks in the 1970s and early 80s, neural networks were sort of out of fashion for various reasons, and people were more focused on symbolic methods and knowledge-based systems. But then there was a kind of renaissance of neural networks starting from the mid-80s. So there was a summer school on connectionism that was organized by Rumelhart, Hinton, and Williams. And then you had sort of various applications. Yeah, Dean Pomeroy made this sort of autonomous driving system, which we'll talk a bit more about next week. And gradually, like in the 1990s, there were these sort of what we might call shallow networks, these kind of 2 or 3 layer neural networks. Then again, there was a time when neural networks were out of fashion because people were looking at support vector machines that were performing better at certain tasks. Then I think in the 2010s, there was another revival, partly due to these parallel processors and GPUs. 2012, I think, was when Jeff Hinton's group used neural networks to get much improved results on image classification. And then the last 5 years, we've had the transformers, the LLMs, and the stable diffusion for image production. Here's some applications. So we already talked about some recent breakthroughs, and here's just another list of the wide range of applications. Now, if you're interested in the history of deep learning, these are 2 different perspectives, which are kind of this one here, which is written by Hinton and his friends. This sort of focuses on recent work, like only from 2012 onwards. This second viewpoint, there's this kind of slightly crazy guy called Jürgen Schmidhuber in Switzerland who he was unhappy with what Hinton wrote because he felt that it didn't give enough information about the early work, so he wrote his own description which focuses on the prehistory, you know, going back to the 1960s and so on. So it's quite interesting to read both of these and get two different perspectives. Okay, now I'm just going to have a little bit of a look at neuroanatomy. This is a little bit sort of background material, a bit outside the scope of the course, but it's interesting from a perspective of what the motivation was for neural networks. So in your body, you have a central nervous system which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and then you have a peripheral nervous system. And if you look at the brain regions, there's a spinal cord, medulla, the pons. There's this thing called the cerebellum, which means little brain, and then there's these areas in the middle here, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland. So all of this area here is very ancient, like these structures date back to if you look at reptiles, they have a lot of these structures in common with humans. They may perform slightly different functions, but they're there. But this area on the top, the cortex, is the thing that's kind of unique to humans. And so this, and again, like if you look at our closest relatives are chimpanzees and bonobos. Apparently we share 98% of our DNA with those other species. But if you look at a human brain and a chimpanzee brain and ask what's the main difference, the main difference is this stuff on the outside, which is called the cortex. Our brain is larger than the chimpanzee brain because it has the cortex. Cortex comes from the Latin word for the bark of a tree, and the cortex is traditionally divided into different lobes. So we talk about the front, well, it's divided into two hemispheres, the left and right hemisphere, and then we talk about the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. And as I said, like this is, you know, if you look at a chimpanzee, the cortex either doesn't exist or is much smaller. So that suggests that the cortex perhaps is used for kind of high-level thinking, and studies have generally borne that out. But also because this larger brain requires more energy, and humans have to eat more meat. They have to consume more calories to keep their larger brain functioning. So, like I say, I won't go through too many of these details, but there's the cortex, as I mentioned. There's the brain stem, is this area that's kind of shared with other animals and reptiles, and the brain stem tends to control low-level autonomic function, so breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, and so on. And the cerebellum controls movement and balance and posture. And then if you look inside the brain stem, you've got the midbrain, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and there's sort of, this is what they do basically. The midbrain controls sort of vision and eye movement. The thalamus is kind of relays information between the cerebral cortex and other areas of the brain, does sort of sensory integration. The hypothalamus controls body temperature and hunger and thirst and so on. And then there's this sort of limbic system, I guess I'm just trying to show you the complexity of what's in there in the human brain. I will put the thalamus, the hippocampus is an interesting one. This thing here is called the hippocampus. It controls short-term memory. So if you do experiments on rats and get them to learn to run through mazes, they tend to use the hippocampus to remember where they are in the maze. And there are studies that if you can probe a particular neuron inside the hippocampus, there may be a neuron that only fires when the rat is in a particular part of the maze. And in fact, there may be a neuron that only fires if it's in a particular location and moving in a particular direction. Now, in humans, the hippocampus is also involved in memory, but it tends to be more symbolic memory, like those studies that psychologists do where they give you a list of pairs of words and they give you some time to remember them, and then they ask you what word went with this. That information tends to be stored in the hippocampus as well. Okay, now let's look more. Let's focus more on the cortex. All of these functions are kind of decentralized in some sense, but a lot of what we know about, but to some extent they are localized. What we know about this often comes from unfortunate people who've had a terrible accident, people who were injured in World War I and lost part of their brain, or had a trucking accident or this or that. Part of someone's brain gets destroyed, and then psychologists like to study that person, and if there's some deficit, then it's assumed that perhaps the part of the brain that was missing is the one that was needed for that function. Yes?
Or a railroad accident?
A railroad, yes. Phineas Gage, thank you. That's right, thank you. Phineas Gage, he had a railroad accident at a...
Yeah, from what I remember, it's explosive went off, sent a rod through the bottom of his skull, went through his frontal cortex, and they realized that afterwards he became a lot more impulsive and aggressive. So they connected the frontal cortex and emotional regulations.
Yeah, so if you didn't hear it, so something went wrong with the explosives, and a metal bar went through his it destroyed part of his brain. Yeah, and then his kind of behaviour changed. Yeah, so there's been a few cases like this. There was another case with someone. He was playing in his I think he was 26 years old at the time, but he was fooling around in his basement with a toy sword, and the sword went up his nose and destroyed part of his brain. So there's always interesting stories behind this. There's another. I think there was EM. There was some guy who was always only known by his initials EM. And it was a similar case. He had a severe case of epilepsy, and they removed part of his frontal cortex and maybe cut the corpus callosum as well. But whatever they did, as a result, he lost the ability to create short-term... he lost the ability to create new memories. So he could remember what had... Even when he was in his 50s, he could remember what had happened to him up until the age of 27 or whatever, when he had this operation, and he could remember what happened in the last 15 minutes, but he couldn't remember anything in between. But it was sort of an interesting story because he was never lonely. Like, all these psychologists were making appointments, like making bookings to go and talk to him and experiment with him. So he was... Yeah, he was never alone. Anyway, but I digress. So this is how we think that, well, again, there's a difference between a right and a left-handed person too, but with a right-handed person, language is processed here and speech here and so on. And there's also interesting other stuff going on here. There's mapping, so the motor functions, sensory functions and the motor functions. So all these nerve endings in your fingers and in your body get mapped to this part of the brain, and some areas get more real estate than others. You know, your fingertips are more sensitive than your leg, so they occupy more brain area. And on this side, there's the motor functions, and you see they do kind of line up, and there are some connections that go across this gap, this sulcus here between these two lobes. And vision, the primary visual cortex is at the back of the head. So that's, you know, because the signals come through your eyes and through the optic nerve to the back of your head. That's why if you get hit on the back of your head, your vision sometimes becomes blurry for several seconds. Okay, so let's zoom in now down to individual neurons. So the brain is made up of neurons. I mean, there's also kind of glia cells that hold the neurons together, but there's about 100 billion neurons, and each neuron, this is kind of, maybe there's no such thing as the typical neuron. I got this image off Wikipedia, but it shows the essential features. So a neuron is a cell, so it has all the properties that a cell has. It's got a cell body, and it's got a nucleus with the DNA in it, and it's got mitochondria and so on. But a normal cell would be round in shape, but a neuron has this very jagged shape that's called a dendrite. Dendrite comes from the Latin word for a tree. And the neuron can receive electrical signals through the dendrites. So there's a certain voltage inside the neuron, and an electrical signal can come from another neuron through this dendrite, and that may increase the voltage inside here. And when the voltage builds up and exceeds some threshold, then it'll send an electrical pulse along this thing here, which is called the axon, and then that can connect to the dendrite of another neuron. So these things are connected together in a circuit, so you can get this kind of chain of firing. Like if this neuron fires and an electrical pulse comes here, it'll change the voltage in the next neuron, and if that happens enough times or from enough different neurons, then the next neuron will fire, and so on. Now this picture here is not quite typical. This is a picture of what's called a motor neuron. So normally this axon would be pretty short. The axon typically might be a few millimeters in length, or maybe a centimeter, but with the motor neurons, the axon is much longer. It could actually be as much as a meter. And the reason for this is like survival. If you put your hand on a hot stove, you react very quickly and pull it off, and it's like the signal goes from your fingertips, to your elbow, and then your shoulder and to the midbrain, and maybe it doesn't even reach the cortex. It just, you react instinctively and pull your hand away. So for that to happen, you need only a small number of neurons involved in the chain. So that's why you have this very long axon, and in order that the charge won't disperse, you actually have this myelinated sheath to keep the charge in there, the same way a coaxial electricity cable has plastic around it to keep the charge in. And people who have certain types of motor neuron disease, this sheath will become demyelinated, and that's why people have very sort of jerky movements. Now, so this picture here, this is taken from a neuroscience textbook. Again, this is really just to illustrate the complexity and the variety of different types of neuron in the actual brain. So this here is a motor neuron that we were just discussing with this long axon. This thing here in the middle is from the olfactory bulb, so that's just behind your nose and is involved in your sense of smell. This is a Purkinje neuron. I mean, this is quite weird. This is very bushy but very flat. So this neuron receives input from a lot of other neurons, but if you look at it side on, it looks like this, but if you twist it around 90 degrees, it looks like that. So it's two-dimensional essentially, but very bushy in those two dimensions. This is from the cortex. So this is probably the most interesting one. This is from the cortex. Remember, the cortex we said is involved with high-level reasoning. And the cortex actually has layers in it. This is the visual cortex is the one that's best understood. And it's made up of layers, and it's a bit hard to see, but that's the cell body there. The majority of connections are within the same layer here. There's a very dense branching within the layer, but there are some connections that go to other layers. Okay. And if we zoom in even further, we get to what's called an ion channel. So again, this is just kind of so that you have the big picture. So I mentioned that when the voltage builds up, it'll cause electrical pulse to go along here. So how does that actually happen? So if we zoom into this little area, you have these things called synapses. I guess what we're looking at here is like the synapse is actually where the axon of one neuron connects with the dendrite of the next neuron. So it's actually the gap sort of between two neurons. And again, this is sort of a cartoon version, but basically you've got these vesicles here that carry charged particles, and when the voltage exceeds the threshold, these vesicles break apart and these charged particles will flow into this intermediate area, and then there are these receptors which open up and allow the charged particles to go into the next neuron. And there's a lot about this that isn't known, like how does learning happen in the brain? So, tomorrow we'll talk about backpropagation and gradient descent. This is normally how learning happens in artificial neural networks. But if you ask how does learning actually happen in the human brain, even today, that's not well understood. People don't really know the answer to that. But we know a little bit about it. There is one process called Hebbian learning, and the way Hebbian learning works is that if if one neuron so remember this is the junction between two neurons. So Hebbian learning, if one neuron fires and then shortly afterwards this next neuron fires, if those two things occur in rapid succession, then somehow the strength of this connection will be increased so that the next time this neuron fires, even more charge will go into the next neuron and make it even more likely to fire. So it's a kind of, the Hebbian learning kind of strengthens connections that already exist and happen in the right timing, and somehow, yeah, if this neuron fires, then somehow a chemical signal comes back here and causes these vesicles, there to be more of them, yeah, and carry greater charge, yeah. So that's one mechanism of learning that's known about. And then if we zoom in even further to this little pink thing here, how does the charge come in? There are people, I mean, these are very minute details, but years ago when I was a postdoc, I was at Brandeis University, and there were people working in the same building as me who spent their whole career, someone might spend their whole career studying one of these ion channels. You know, some people really study this stuff in great detail. Somehow, under certain chemical conditions, it's like a gateway that opens and allows these ions to flow through. And there are different types of channel. There are calcium channels and sodium channels, and they all have slightly different chemistry. Okay, so I guess the point I'm making here is that there is a lot of complexity in the real situation with the chemistry and the physicality of what's going on here. But for artificial neural networks, we try to strip out the complexity if we can and just try to come up with a simpler model, but which captures the essential features of what's going on in the brain. And this just telling you there's massively parallel. Like, you know, in the early programming courses, you learn how to write a sort of sequential program that does this and then this and then this. But what's going on here is the total number of steps may be relatively small, but it's massively parallel. So there's like lots and lots of units that are updating in parallel. Yes? Is that latency for constant? Yeah. So, sorry. So just to go through this, so there's 100 billion neurons in the brain, and on average 10,000 synapses. So on average, 10,000 neurons are feeding into each. On average, a neuron is receiving signals from 10,000 other neurons. Yeah, the latency. So this is, I mean, when one neuron fires, how long does it take for the next neuron in the chain to fire? It is on the order of milliseconds. Yeah, maybe as low as 1 millisecond in some cases. This is what you're asking, is it? Yeah, it sounds surprising. We're talking about the brain, of course. In the GPU, maybe different. But it's like it takes a millisecond. Well, after this neuron fires, it takes a millisecond for the next neuron to fire. So that's why we come up with this crude sort of, there's only sort of, if it was sequential, it could only be 100, you know, this is like these psychology, you flash a word on the screen and ask someone to say the word, they can do it in 400 milliseconds. So this is where we come up with this idea of like only a few hundred steps, but each step is massively parallel. Good question. Okay, so now let's zoom out again and look at what's known about the organization in the cortex. So this is studies that were done in the 1950s by Hubel and Wiesel, late 50s, I guess, and they found it's a bit unfortunate in a way how they did these experiments. You know, they'd get a cat and they'd sort of, you know, put a cat in the apparatus, and then they'd like have a probe that would probe a particular neuron inside the visual cortex of the cat. And they'd get the cat to look at an image of a line in a particular direction, and they found that in the primary visual cortex there were some neurons which, you know, there might be a neuron that only fires if the image is of a line at a particular angle, kind of thing. So there's this kind of range of neurons that respond to lines at different angles. And then when you move up into the next layer, you know, the secondary and tertiary visual cortex, then you see more sophisticated visual features. Well, you could have something that responds to a line at a particular angle and moving in a certain direction. And then, but higher up, you may have, like, it may be responding to larger, kind of more complicated objects. And I'm mentioning this because this is one of the few, vision is one of the few areas where we can draw a very close analogy between the brain and the artificial neural networks. Some of the other things like language processing, the analogy is not quite so close. And so this work by Hubel and Wiesel is kind of mirrored in these convolutional networks that we'll get to in week 4, that for image processing, that actually there is sort of, we have layers of artificial neurons, and at in the first layer, the artificial neurons respond to these very small features, and then as you move through the network, they're recognizing larger and larger features. And this is, I apologize, the resolution is not that good, but this is actually mapping some of these features. So they train a neural network and they look at neurons in the first layer and the second layer and the third layer. Well, in the first layer, they're just looking at the actual weights. In the second and third layer, what they're doing is saying, okay, what input would maximally stimulate this neuron? And sorry, I apologize for the resolution, but I think this network was trained on images of motor cars. So you can see in the first layer, you've got like lines at various angles. You know, it's very similar to what Hubel and Wiesel found in the actual brain. At the second layer, you've got kind of circles and curved lines and so on in different colors. The third layer, this is actually, I mean, I'm sorry you can't see this very well, but it's like, might look like a hubcap or something like that, or a rear view mirror. And so this is kind of individual features that you may use to recognize a motor car. This is just, I don't know, these slides here just are meant to illustrate what we're going to be talking about throughout the course. So we'll talk quite a bit about image processing. Then in week 8, I think we'll get to reinforcement learning. So this is where we have a sort of deep network that maybe takes in a computer screen and is trying to play a computer game, and the output will determine one of several actions that can be taken with a joystick. And we'll also be looking at I didn't put a slide in here, but we're looking at language processing. Sorry, this is a bit out of order. So maybe I'll go through a different. So we'll be looking at language processing. We'll be looking at in weeks 5 and 7. So we'll look at what's called a recurrent network, where you have like a sequence of inputs that are fed into the network, and you have a sequence of outputs. And then we'll look at like more recent advances like the transformer network, which look for correlations in different parts of the input. And then in week 8 is when we'll move on to the reinforcement learning. And then in week 9 we'll look at unsupervised learning. Yeah. So this is just image generation through stable diffusion. Okay. Good. Where are we? Okay. Sorry, we're nearly out of time. I think the recording's about to cut off. So sorry, I still didn't get to perceptrons. I know some of you have tutorials this afternoon. So, but anyway, this is what we'll be talking about on Wednesday. We'll be looking at attempts to make a simplified version of a real neuron and have a kind of learning algorithm where that neuron can learn to recognize digits or other things.